Welcome to Nighttime History, where we explore the fascinating realities behind history's most misunderstood people and places. I'm delighted you've joined us for tonight's journey into one of history's most overlooked worlds. You've probably heard that medieval peasants were dirty, ignorant, and spent their entire lives bent over in muddy fields, barely surviving on scraps. But the reality is far more interesting. These communities developed some of the most sophisticated agricultural systems in human history, maintained complex social networks that would put modern neighborhoods to shame, and created innovations that we still use today. Tonight, we're stepping into a typical medieval village around the year 1250, somewhere in the heart of Europe. The smell of wood smoke drifts from thatched roofs. Roosters crow in the pre-dawn darkness. And, contrary to popular belief, the people stirring to life in these humble homes are about to demonstrate skills, knowledge, and ingenuity that would astonish us. The first myth we need to shatter is that peasants lived in complete ignorance and squalor. Archaeological evidence paints a dramatically different picture. Medieval peasants were master meteorologists who could predict weather patterns weeks in advance by reading cloud formations, wind directions, and animal behavior. They were botanists who knew the properties of hundreds of plants for food, medicine, and crafts. They were engineers who designed drainage systems, mill mechanisms, and construction techniques that lasted for centuries. As the first pale light creeps over the village, you hear the gentle lowing of cattle and the rustle of straw as families begin their day. But this isn't the chaotic scramble you might imagine. Medieval peasant households operated with military precision because survival depended on it. The matriarch of the house rises first, usually around 4 in the morning. She doesn't stumble around in darkness though. Contrary to what you've seen in movies, peasant homes weren't pitch-black caves. They used rushes soaked in animal fat as candles and maintained carefully banked fires that could be quickly rekindled. The main room stays surprisingly warm through these techniques, even in winter. Her first task involves checking the brewing. Yes, brewing. Every peasant household produced its own ale because water was often unsafe to drink. She tests the fermenting grain with practiced fingers, adjusting the mixture based on temperature, smell, and texture. This isn't simple beer making. Medieval ale production required understanding complex chemical processes, timing fermentation cycles, and maintaining precise ingredient ratios. A bad batch could mean illness or even death for the family. While she works, her husband emerges and immediately checks their small livestock. Peasants typically kept chickens, a pig or two, maybe a goat. These animals represent enormous wealth. A single pig provided meat for months when slaughtered, plus valuable fat for cooking and lighting. But keeping them alive required constant vigilance against wolves, thieves, and disease. He examines each animal for signs of illness, checks their food and water, and repairs any damage to their enclosures from the night. The children wake next and immediately begin their assigned tasks. Medieval childhood wasn't about play and learning. By age 5, children were contributing essential labor to family survival. The youngest might gather eggs or feed chickens. Older children had more complex responsibilities, tracking which fields needed attention, monitoring weather signs, or beginning their apprenticeships in adult skills. But here's what's truly remarkable. Peasant families didn't just react to their environment. They actively managed and improved it. They practiced crop rotation centuries before it became scientific doctrine. They selectively bred their animals for desired traits. They engineered their landscapes, creating terraces, irrigation channels, and windbreaks that maximized agricultural productivity. As the sun rises higher, the family shares their morning meal. And contrary to popular belief, peasant diets were surprisingly varied and nutritious. They ate multiple types of grains, seasonal vegetables, dairy products, eggs, and meat several times per week. They preserved foods through sophisticated techniques, smoking, salting, fermentation, and root cellars that maintained perfect temperatures and humidity. Archaeological analysis of medieval peasant remains shows they were generally well nourished and lived longer than many people assume. The stereotype of the malnourished, disease-ridden serf comes largely from periods of crisis, like famines or plagues, not from normal daily life. After breakfast, the real work begins. But even this follows intricate patterns most people never realize. Peasants didn't randomly wander into fields and start digging. They organized their labor according to complex rotating schedules that balanced soil health, crop yields, seasonal timing, and community obligations. The famous three-field system wasn't just about growing different crops, it was an elaborate form of ecological management. One field grew grains that depleted nitrogen, another grew legumes that restored it. The third lay fallow, allowing soil to recover while providing grazing for animals whose manure further enriched it. This system maintained soil fertility for centuries without any external inputs. But peasants were innovating constantly within these frameworks. They experimented with new seed varieties, developed improved ploughing techniques, and shared successful innovations across entire regions. Medieval agricultural manuscripts reveal sophisticated understanding of soil chemistry, plant biology, and environmental management. As morning progresses, you'd see the village come alive with coordinated activity. This isn't individual families struggling alone. Medieval peasant communities were incredibly interconnected, with elaborate systems of mutual aid, shared resources, and collective decision-making. Take ploughing, for example. Most peasant families couldn't afford a full plough team of 8 oxen, so they pooled their animals and labour. One family might contribute 2 oxen, another the plough, a third the specialised knowledge of the ploughman. They worked each other's fields in careful rotation, ensuring everyone's land got proper attention at the optimal time. This cooperation extended to every aspect of village life. Families shared expensive tools like harrows, seeders, and harvesting equipment. They coordinated planting schedules so labour-intensive tasks could be handled collectively. During harvest season, entire villages worked together in carefully choreographed teams that could process enormous amounts of grain in remarkably short time periods. The social complexity rivaled anything in medieval courts. Villages had their own systems of governance, with elected officials, formal procedures for resolving disputes, and sophisticated methods for managing common resources like forests, streams, and grazing lands. Before we continue exploring these remarkable communities, I'd love to invite you to join our Nighttime History family. If you're finding these insights as fascinating as I am, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into history's most intriguing topics. And please hit that like button to help others discover these stories. I'm genuinely curious what aspect of peasant life surprises you most so far, or what other historical communities you'd like us to explore. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one and often use your suggestions for future episodes. Now, let's return to our medieval village and discover some truly remarkable innovations that most people never associate with peasant life. By mid-morning, you'd witness something that would revolutionize your understanding of medieval technology. Peasants weren't using primitive tools and crude methods. They were employing sophisticated machinery that represented the cutting edge of engineering for their time. The village mill, for instance, wasn't just a simple wheel turning stones. Medieval mills were precision machines with complex gear systems, adjustable grinding plates, and ingenious mechanisms for controlling water flow or wind power. The miller wasn't just someone who poured grain into a hole. He was a skilled technician who understood mechanical principles, maintained intricate equipment, and could adjust his machinery for different types of grain and desired textures. Peasants also developed surprisingly advanced metallurgy. Village smiths didn't just bang hot metal randomly. They understood carbon content, heat treatment, and alloy composition well enough to create tools that were sharper, stronger, and longer lasting than many modern implements. Archaeological analysis reveals medieval peasant tools with sophisticated designs optimized for specific tasks. Plowshares with carefully calculated curves for different soil types. Sickles with precisely angled blades for efficient grain cutting. And axes balanced for maximum effectiveness with minimum effort. But perhaps most impressive was their approach to land management. Medieval peasants were practicing what we now call permaculture, sustainable agriculture, and ecosystem management. They understood that agriculture wasn't about fighting nature, but working with natural systems to create abundance. They planted hedgerows that provided windbreaks, prevented soil erosion, offered habitat for beneficial insects, and produced food, medicine, and craft materials. They managed forests through selective cutting that maintained biodiversity while providing timber, fuel, and forage for animals. They created integrated systems where every element served multiple purposes and supported the health of the whole. As noon approaches in our village, you'd see another side of peasant life that defies stereotypes. These communities weren't isolated backwaters cut off from the wider world. They were connected to extensive trade networks, participated in regional markets, and stayed informed about political and economic developments across Europe. Peasant families regularly travelled to nearby towns for market days, bringing surplus produce, handcrafted goods, and specialised products like cheese, ale, or textiles. They returned with items they couldn't produce locally: salt, metal goods, exotic spices, and news from distant places. These market connections meant that innovations, ideas, and cultural practices spread rapidly through peasant communities across vast distances. The sophistication continues as we observe their approaches to health and medicine. Medieval peasants had detailed knowledge of herbal remedies, surgical procedures, and preventive health practices. Village-wise women could set broken bones, assist difficult births, treat infections, and manage chronic conditions using techniques that were often more effective than the medical practices of nobles and clergy. They understood the importance of hygiene, despite modern stereotypes. Archaeological evidence shows peasant communities maintained clean water sources, managed waste systematically, and practiced personal cleanliness within the constraints of their resources. Public bathhouses were common even in small villages, and personal bathing was a regular practice, not the rare occurrence depicted in popular culture. As afternoon settles over our medieval village, we've only begun to scratch the surface of these remarkable communities. The intricate systems of knowledge, cooperation, and innovation that governed peasant life created some of the most sustainable and resilient societies in human history. Tomorrow, we'll continue our exploration by diving deep into how seasonal cycles shaped every aspect of peasant existence, and discover agricultural techniques so sophisticated that modern farmers are still learning from them. As afternoon settles over our medieval village, the true genius of peasant life becomes clear when you understand how deeply seasonal rhythms shaped every single decision, tradition, and daily activity. Contrary to popular belief, medieval peasants didn't simply plant in spring and harvest in fall. They orchestrated an intricate 12-month symphony of interconnected activities that would make modern project managers weep with envy. Right now, in our midsummer village, you'd witness what historians call the hungry gap season, that crucial period between when stored grain from last year's harvest runs dangerously low and this year's crops aren't quite ready. But peasants weren't helplessly starving during these weeks. They had developed sophisticated strategies to bridge this gap that reveal their deep understanding of nutrition, food science, and resource management. Walk through the village gardens in July, and you'd see something that would astonish modern nutritionists. Peasant families cultivated what we'd now recognize as superfood gardens. They grew dozens of varieties of leafy greens, herbs, and vegetables specifically timed to provide maximum nutrition during the hungry gap. Nettle soup, rich in iron and vitamins, sustained families through these lean weeks. Wild garlic provided essential nutrients while warding off infections. Dandelion greens, chickweed, and lamb's quarters delivered concentrated nutrition that modern health enthusiasts pay premium prices to obtain. But here's what's truly remarkable about peasant seasonal planning. They didn't just manage food production, they coordinated every aspect of community life to match natural rhythms in ways that maximized efficiency and minimized risk. Take clothing production, for example. You've probably heard that medieval people wore the same dirty rags year-round. The reality is far more sophisticated. Peasant families operated complex textile production schedules that aligned perfectly with agricultural cycles. During winter's quiet months, when field work slowed, every household hummed with spinning wheels and looms. Women and children processed flax and wool harvested months earlier, creating not just clothing but valuable trade goods. They timed sheep shearing to coincide with optimal wool quality, processed plant fibers when weather conditions were perfect for drying and preparation, and coordinated dyeing activities with the seasonal availability of specific plants and minerals. The result was clothing systems far more practical than anything we wear today. Peasant garments were designed for durability, comfort, and adaptability to changing weather conditions. They layered different weights of wool and linen to create insulation systems that could be adjusted throughout the day. Their understanding of textile properties let them create water-resistant outer garments, breathable underlayers, and work clothes that protected against specific hazards while allowing full range of motion. As summer deepens, you'd observe another aspect of peasant seasonal mastery that completely contradicts modern assumptions about medieval hygiene and health management. Peasants didn't ignore cleanliness and healthcare. They integrated both into their seasonal cycles with scientific precision. Summer was prime time for gathering medicinal plants, but not randomly. Peasant healers knew exactly when each plant reached peak potency. They harvested Sainten, John's wort, at the summer solstice, when its active compounds were highest. They collected elderflowers in early morning when essential oils were most concentrated. They timed the gathering of dozens of different herbs, roots, and berries to capture maximum therapeutic benefit. These weren't superstitious rituals. Modern analysis confirms that peasant timing was often scientifically accurate. Many plants do reach peak medicinal potency at specific times of year, even specific times of day. Medieval peasants had discovered, through careful observation, what we now understand through laboratory analysis. They also scheduled healthcare activities seasonally. Summer's warmth made it ideal for treating certain conditions, performing minor surgeries, and conducting preventive health practices. Villages often coordinated communal health activities, like deworming treatments for both humans and animals, during optimal seasonal windows. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of peasant seasonal management was their approach to risk mitigation. Medieval agriculture was inherently uncertain. Weather could destroy crops, diseases could devastate animals, political upheavals could disrupt trade. Peasant communities developed incredibly sophisticated systems for managing these risks across seasonal cycles. They practiced what modern economists call portfolio diversification, but applied it to agriculture. Different crops planted in different fields at different times meant that catastrophic failure of one element rarely threatened the entire food system. Early grains provided security against late frosts. Late varieties offered insurance against early droughts. Root vegetables stored underground could survive above-ground disasters. They also coordinated risk management across households and communities. Families specialized in different aspects of production, then shared resources to ensure everyone's survival. One household might focus on dairy production, another on grain, a third on vegetables and herbs. During good years, they built up reserves. During difficult years, they had multiple fallback options. As late summer arrives, you'd witness the most complex choreography in the peasant calendar: harvest coordination. This wasn't just about cutting grain and gathering it up. Medieval harvests required precise timing, sophisticated logistics, and community-wide cooperation that would challenge modern supply chain managers. Peasants had identified dozens of indicators for optimal harvest timing. They read grain moisture content by touch, sound, and appearance. They monitored weather patterns weeks in advance to predict ideal harvesting windows. They understood that harvesting too early meant lower yields and poor storage quality, while harvesting too late risked losses to weather, birds, and grain shattering. But timing was just the beginning. Medieval harvests were massive logistical operations involving hundreds of people working in carefully coordinated teams. Different groups handled cutting, binding, loading, transporting, and processing grain. Each task required specific skills and tools, and delays in any one area could jeopardize the entire harvest. Watch a medieval harvest in action, and you'd see efficiency that rivals modern mechanized operations. Teams of experienced workers moved through fields in systematic patterns that minimized wasted motion and maximized speed. They used specialized tools designed for specific tasks, different sickles for different grain types, scythes balanced for all-day use, and binding techniques that secured grain bundles while allowing air circulation for proper drying. The social coordination was equally impressive. Communities established complex systems for fairly distributing harvest labor obligations. Families contributed work proportional to their landholding and benefited proportionally from communal activities like processing and storage. Disputes were rare because everyone understood the systems and their roles within them. After the grain harvest, peasant communities shifted into what we might call food processing mode. But this wasn't simple grinding and storage. Medieval peasants were master food scientists who understood preservation, nutrition, and flavor development in ways that would impress modern chefs and food technologists. They processed grains into dozens of different products, each optimized for specific purposes. Coarse meals for hearty porridges and breads that provided sustained energy for physical labor. Fine flours for special occasions and dishes that required delicate textures. Partially processed grains that could be quickly prepared during busy periods. Fermented grain products that provided probiotics and enhanced nutrition. Their brewing and fermentation knowledge was particularly sophisticated. Peasant families produced various alcoholic beverages not just for enjoyment, but as essential nutrition and food safety tools. Different types of ale provided different nutritional profiles and storage characteristics. Winemaking, where grapes grew, involved complex understanding of fermentation timing, temperature control, and flavor development. They also mastered dairy processing in ways that maximized both nutrition and storage life. Different cheeses provided protein sources that could be stored for months or even years. Fermented dairy products like buttermilk and various cultured preparations provided probiotics that supported digestive health. Butter production involved techniques for creating products that remained stable without refrigeration. As autumn approaches, peasant communities enter another phase that reveals their sophisticated understanding of resource management and long-term planning. This is when they made critical decisions about animal management that would determine protein availability throughout the coming year. Contrary to popular belief, peasants didn't simply slaughter animals randomly when cold weather arrived. They calculated optimal slaughter timing based on feed availability, animal condition, preservation capacity, and family needs. Some animals were kept through winter to provide milk, eggs, and breeding stock for the following year. Others were processed at specific times to maximize meat quality and preservation success. The butchering process itself demonstrated remarkable knowledge of anatomy, meat science, and preservation techniques. Every part of each animal was utilized according to sophisticated understanding of storage methods and nutritional needs. Fresh meat was consumed immediately or preserved through smoking, salting, or fermentation. Organ meats were processed into sausages and other preserved products rich in essential nutrients. Bones were processed for marrow, gelatin, and tool-making materials. Fat rendering was particularly crucial, as animal fats provided essential calories, cooking medium, lighting fuel, and soap-making materials. Peasants understood the properties of different animal fats and processed them accordingly. Pork fat became lard for cooking and preservation. Beef fat was rendered into tallow for candles and soap. Sheep fat was processed differently for various household and craft applications. As we move deeper into autumn in our medieval village, the genius of peasant seasonal planning becomes even more apparent in their approach to fuel and heating preparation. Modern people assume medieval peasants were constantly cold and struggled to heat their homes. The reality shows sophisticated energy management that maximized warmth while conserving resources. Peasant families spent months preparing for winter heating needs, but not just by chopping firewood. They harvested different types of fuel for different purposes, understanding burn characteristics, heat output, and availability patterns. Hardwoods for long-burning overnight fires, softwoods for quick-starting morning fires, specific woods for cooking that imparted desired flavors without creating too much smoke. They also prepared alternative fuel sources that modern people rarely consider. Dried animal dung, mixed with straw and formed into bricks, provided steady, long-burning fuel that was often more available than wood. Dried peat, where available, offered efficient heating fuel. even dried crop residues, were processed into fuel sources that extended their heating capacity. But the most impressive aspect of peasant fuel management was their understanding of combustion efficiency and heat conservation. They designed their heating systems to extract maximum warmth from minimum fuel. Carefully constructed fireplaces with specific proportions maximized heat output while minimizing smoke. Innovative chimney designs created proper draft while retaining heat. Techniques for banking fires overnight meant they rarely had to restart from cold ashes. Their homes were also designed as integrated heating systems that would impress modern energy efficiency experts. Thick walls with specific construction techniques provided insulation. Strategic placement of animal areas allowed body heat from livestock to warm human living spaces. Careful attention to air circulation prevented dampness while retaining warmth. As winter approaches in our village, peasant seasonal mastery reaches its peak complexity in their approach to nutrition and health maintenance during the challenging cold months. They didn't simply hope to survive until spring. They planned nutritional strategies that maintained health, energy, and even enjoyment throughout the darkest period of the year. The preserved foods they'd prepared weren't just about calories. Peasant families understood nutritional balance in ways that ensured they received essential vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients even when fresh foods were unavailable. Fermented vegetables provided vitamin C that prevented scurvy. Preserved meats supplied protein and B vitamins. Stored grains offered carbohydrates and fiber. Dried fruits and nuts contributed essential minerals and healthy fats. But their winter nutrition went beyond just preserved foods. Medieval peasants were expert foragers who knew how to find nutritious foods even in the dead of winter. They harvested tree nuts that had been stored by squirrels. They dug roots and tubers that remained viable under snow. They collected evergreen needles that provided vitamin C. They even knew techniques for processing acorns and other abundant but normally inedible foods into nutritious meal supplements. Their seasonal approach to community life also reached full complexity during winter months. This was when villages became centers of craft production, social bonding, and knowledge transfer that sustained communities through isolation and hardship. Contrary to the image of peasants huddled miserably in dark huts, winter villages buzzed with productive activity and social connection. Winter evenings in our medieval village reveal something that shatters every stereotype about peasant isolation and ignorance. Step into any peasant home after sunset during the cold months, and you'd find yourself in the middle of sophisticated social networks that would put modern communities to shame. These weren't scattered individuals barely surviving in primitive conditions. They were members of intricate, interdependent societies with complex governance systems, elaborate cultural traditions, and social safety nets that ensured virtually no one faced hardship alone. The physical layout of peasant villages tells this story immediately. Contrary to popular images of random huts scattered across the landscape, medieval villages followed carefully planned designs that facilitated community interaction and mutual support. Houses clustered around central areas where people naturally gathered. Common wells, bake ovens, and meeting spaces created focal points that brought neighbours together daily. Even the positioning of individual homes reflected social relationships, with extended families often building near each other, and craft specialists locating their workshops for easy community access. But the real revelation comes when you understand how medieval peasant households actually functioned. You've probably heard that peasant families were nuclear units struggling in isolation. Archaeological evidence reveals something far more complex and fascinating. Medieval peasant households often included multiple generations, unrelated workers, apprentices, and temporary residents in fluid arrangements that adapted constantly to economic needs and social obligations. A typical peasant household might include grandparents who provided childcare and specialized knowledge, unmarried adult siblings who contributed labor and skills, apprentices learning trades, and seasonal workers during busy periods. These weren't static arrangements. People moved between households based on changing circumstances, work opportunities, and life cycle needs. Young adults might spend years working in different households to learn skills, earn money, or wait for inheritance opportunities. This flexibility created incredibly resilient support systems. When illness, injury, or economic hardship struck one family, the extended household network automatically absorbed the shock. Children whose parents died weren't abandoned or institutionalized. They were seamlessly integrated into related households where they continued their upbringing and education. Elderly people weren't isolated or neglected. They remained productive members of multi-generational households where their knowledge and experience were valued assets. The decision-making processes within these complex households would surprise modern people accustomed to individual autonomy. Medieval peasant households operated more like small corporations, with different members contributing different skills and resources while sharing in collective outcomes. Major decisions about farming, financial investments, marriage arrangements, and resource allocation involved extensive consultation and negotiation among household members. Women played particularly crucial roles in these systems that contradict every stereotype about medieval gender relations. While legal systems often restricted women's formal rights, the practical realities of peasant life meant that women wielded enormous influence over household decisions and community affairs. They managed complex domestic economies, made critical agricultural decisions, and often controlled significant financial resources through their specialized knowledge and skills. Peasant women were master resource managers who coordinated household production, processed and preserved foods, managed livestock, and maintained extensive knowledge of herbal medicine and healthcare. They controlled valuable resources like dairy products, textiles, and craft goods that generated substantial income for their families. During their husbands' frequent absences for seasonal work, military service, or trade activities, women often functioned as de facto heads of household with complete authority over farming and business decisions. The marriage arrangements in peasant communities reveal another sophisticated social system that balanced individual desires with community stability and economic practicality. Contrary to romantic notions about either forced marriages or free choice, peasant marriages involved complex negotiations among multiple parties with various interests and concerns. Young people had significant input into their marriage choices, but within frameworks shaped by economic compatibility, social connections, and community approval. Families considered not just the personal qualities of potential spouses, but how the union would affect land holdings, labor arrangements, and extended family relationships. Communities had informal veto power over marriages that might create conflicts or economic instability. But these weren't cold, calculating arrangements devoid of affection. Archaeological evidence from letters, wills, and other personal documents reveals that peasant marriages often developed into loving partnerships based on mutual respect, shared labour, and common interests. The practical foundation actually seemed to create stronger long-term relationships than purely romantic matches. The governance systems that emerged in peasant villages would impress modern political scientists studying democracy and community organisation. Most villages developed sophisticated forms of self-governance that balanced individual rights with collective needs while maintaining order and resolving disputes peacefully. Village assemblies, typically called moots or similar terms, brought together all adult male household heads to make collective decisions about resource management, conflict resolution, and community regulations. These weren't token consultations dominated by local lords. They were genuine democratic processes where ordinary peasants debated issues, proposed solutions, and voted on policies that affected everyone's daily life. The range of issues handled by village assemblies would surprise people who assume peasants had no control over their circumstances. They established regulations for managing common resources like forests, grazing lands, and water sources. They set standards for craft production and trade practices. They created and enforced rules about animal control, property maintenance, and public behaviour. They coordinated community projects like road repair, bridge building, and defensive preparations. Most importantly, village assemblies developed sophisticated systems for resolving disputes that avoided both violence and outside intervention. They created procedures for investigating conflicts, hearing testimony, and reaching fair settlements that restored community harmony. The emphasis was always on repairing relationships rather than punishing wrongdoers, because everyone had to continue living and working together. The enforcement mechanisms for these community decisions reveal another layer of social complexity. Villages developed elaborate systems of social pressure, economic sanctions, and community service that encouraged compliance while maintaining social cohesion. Public shaming, temporary exclusion from community activities, and economic boycotts were far more effective than physical punishment for maintaining order in tight-knit communities. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of peasant social organisation was their approach to economic cooperation and mutual aid. Medieval peasant communities created informal insurance systems and cooperative arrangements that provided security and opportunity for everyone while maximising collective productivity. Take the famous common field system that historians often misunderstand. These weren't primitive arrangements where everyone worked together inefficiently. They were sophisticated resource-sharing systems that allowed families with different assets and capabilities to combine their resources for mutual benefit. A family with extra oxen could team up with families who had larger land holdings but fewer animals. Families with specialised skills could trade their expertise for access to tools or resources they couldn't afford individually. These cooperative arrangements extended far beyond agriculture. Villages developed systems for sharing expensive equipment like mills, ovens, and specialised craft tools. They organised collective purchasing of materials that were cheaper in bulk quantities. They coordinated labour exchanges that allowed families to tackle large projects or handle seasonal labour demands that exceeded their individual capacity. The financial sophistication of these systems would surprise modern economists. Peasant communities developed complex credit arrangements, investment partnerships, and risk-sharing agreements that functioned without formal banking systems, or legal enforcement mechanisms. They were based entirely on social relationships, reputation, and community pressure for compliance. Peasant families routinely made loans to each other for seeds, animals, or equipment, with repayment terms adjusted for seasonal cycles and economic circumstances. They created investment partnerships for expensive projects like mill construction or land improvement that benefited entire communities. They even developed early forms of insurance where families contributed to common funds that supported members who faced disasters or emergencies. The record keeping for these complex financial relationships reveals another myth-busting aspect of peasant life. These weren't illiterate people operating by memory and guesswork. Many peasant communities maintained detailed written records of debts, agreements, and transactions. Even households, where no one could read or write, often employed scribes or literate neighbours to document important agreements and financial arrangements. But the social sophistication goes even deeper when you examine peasant approaches to education and knowledge transmission. Medieval peasant communities developed elaborate informal education systems that ensured essential knowledge and skills passed effectively from generation to generation while adapting to changing circumstances and new challenges. Children didn't attend formal schools, but they received incredibly comprehensive educations that prepared them for adult responsibilities and citizenship in their communities. They learned not just practical skills like farming, crafts, and household management, but also social skills, cultural traditions, legal knowledge, and community values through carefully structured apprenticeships and mentoring relationships. The apprenticeship systems extended far beyond craft guilds in cities. Rural communities created informal apprenticeships for virtually every adult role and responsibility. Young people rotated through different households and work situations to learn diverse skills and gain exposure to different approaches and techniques. They learned not just how to perform tasks, but why specific methods were preferred, and how to adapt techniques to changing circumstances. This education system also included what we'd now recognize as civic education. Young people learned about community governance, legal procedures, conflict resolution, and their rights and responsibilities as community members. They participated in village assemblies as observers before gaining full voting rights as adult householders. They learned the complex web of relationships, obligations, and expectations that bound communities together. The cultural and recreational aspects of peasant community life reveal yet another dimension that contradicts stereotypes about medieval rural life as grim and joyless. Peasant communities maintained rich traditions of music, storytelling, games, and celebrations that provided entertainment, social bonding, and cultural continuity across generations. Village festivals and celebrations weren't rare interruptions in otherwise dreary lives. They were regular features of community life that marked seasonal transitions, religious observances, and important social events like marriages, births, and coming-of-age ceremonies. These gatherings served multiple functions beyond entertainment. They reinforced social bonds, provided opportunities for young people to meet potential spouses, allowed for the exchange of news and information, and created shared cultural experiences that strengthened community identity. The music and storytelling traditions maintained by peasant communities preserved historical knowledge, moral teachings, and cultural values in forms that were engaging and memorable. Professional entertainers, like travelling minstrels, brought news and stories from distant places, But local communities also developed their own talented musicians, storytellers, and performers who created and maintained cultural traditions specific to their regions and communities. Games and sports weren't just idle pastimes. They served as training for practical skills, outlets for competitive impulses that might otherwise create conflicts, and ways of building physical fitness and coordination. Many peasant games directly prepared players for work activities or military service while providing enjoyable social interaction. The sophistication of peasant social organization becomes most apparent when you examine how these communities handled what we now call social services and welfare systems. Medieval peasant villages created comprehensive support networks that ensured virtually no community member faced abandonment or destitution, even during the most challenging circumstances. These weren't formal institutions like modern welfare systems. They were organic networks of mutual obligation and reciprocal assistance that operated automatically when needs arose. Families who prospered during good years understood they had obligations to support neighbours who faced difficulties. Community members who received assistance during hard times were expected to provide help to others when their circumstances improved. The scope of these support systems extended to every aspect of life where individual families might face overwhelming challenges. Communities coordinated childcare for working parents, provided nursing care for the sick and elderly, offered temporary housing for families whose homes were damaged, and supplied food and resources for households facing economic crises. But these systems also went beyond emergency assistance to provide opportunities for advancement and improvement. Communities often pooled resources to help promising young people acquire expensive training or equipment that would benefit both the individual and the community. They created systems for sharing knowledge and innovations that helped everyone improve their techniques and productivity. The maintenance of these complex social systems required constant attention and adjustment. But peasant communities had developed sophisticated mechanisms for ensuring they continued functioning effectively across generations and changing circumstances. They had evolved into some of the most resilient and adaptive social organizations in human history, capable of maintaining stability and prosperity for centuries while adjusting to external pressures and internal changes. The maintenance of these complex social systems required tools and techniques far more sophisticated than the crude implements most people imagine when they think of medieval peasant life. Walk into a peasant workshop or examine the equipment stored in a medieval barn, and you'd encounter technology that would challenge your assumptions about the supposed primitiveness of the Middle Ages. Take the humble plough, which most people picture as a simple wooden stick dragged through dirt by exhausted oxen. The reality is that medieval ploughs were precision-engineered machines that represented centuries of accumulated innovation and technical refinement. The heavy-wheeled plough that revolutionized northern European agriculture wasn't just bigger than earlier versions. It incorporated sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics, draft animal behavior, and metallurgical principles that wouldn't be out of place in a modern engineering textbook. The moldboard, that curved piece of wood or metal that turns the soil, required precise mathematical calculations to achieve the correct angle for different soil types and conditions. Too steep, and it would require excessive force from the draft animals while creating poor furrow quality. Too shallow, and it wouldn't properly turn the soil or bury crop residues. Medieval plough makers developed different moldboard designs for clay soils, sandy soils, and mixed conditions, each optimized through generations of testing and refinement. But the real sophistication shows in the adjustable components that allowed a single plough to be customized for different tasks and conditions. The ploughshare, the cutting edge that sliced through soil, could be adjusted for depth and angle. The coulter, the vertical knife that cut through surface vegetation, could be positioned to handle different types of crop residues and weeds. These weren't random modifications. They represented systematic understanding of how different adjustments affected soil preparation, draft requirements, and crop establishment. The metallurgy involved in creating these components would impress modern materials scientists. Medieval smiths understood that different parts of the plough required different steel properties. The ploughshare needed to be extremely hard to maintain a sharp edge, while resisting wear from abrasive soil particles. But it also needed enough toughness to avoid brittle fracture when hitting rocks or roots. They achieved this through sophisticated heat treatment processes that created composite structures with hard cutting edges and tough supporting cores. The draft animal management systems that powered these ploughs reveal another layer of technical sophistication that most people never consider. Medieval peasants weren't just hitching random animals to ploughs and hoping for the best. They developed comprehensive systems for breeding, training, and managing draft animals that maximized power output while maintaining animal health and longevity. Oxen, the preferred draft animals in much of medieval Europe, required years of specialized training to work effectively in plough teams. Young animals were gradually conditioned to accept harnesses, respond to voice commands, and coordinate their movements with other team members. Experienced oxen could follow furrows with minimal guidance, adjust their pace to soil conditions, and even anticipate the ploughman's intentions based on subtle cues. The harness systems themselves represented centuries of evolutionary development. Contrary to popular images of crude ropes and wooden yokes, medieval draft harnesses were sophisticated pieces of equipment that distributed loads efficiently while allowing animals maximum freedom of movement. Different harness designs were used for different animals and different tasks, each optimized for specific anatomical and behavioral characteristics. The feeding and care protocols for draft animals would meet modern veterinary standards. Peasant communities understood that working animals required high-quality nutrition precisely timed to match their energy expenditure. They calculated feed rations based on animal size, workload, and seasonal conditions. They provided supplements during intensive work periods and adjusted feeding schedules to optimize energy availability during peak labor demands. But medieval agricultural innovation extended far beyond ploughing into sophisticated systems for managing every aspect of crop production. Seed preparation techniques reveal knowledge of plant biology that wouldn't be formalized by scientists for centuries. Peasant farmers routinely treated seeds with various substances to improve germination rates, protect against diseases, and enhance early plant growth. They understood that different seeds required different preparation methods. Grain seeds were often soaked in solutions that removed growth inhibitors and primed them for rapid germination. Legume seeds were treated with materials that promoted the development of beneficial root bacteria. Vegetable seeds received protective coatings that deterred insects and fungal attacks during the vulnerable germination period. The timing of seed planting incorporated sophisticated understanding of soil temperature, moisture conditions, and seasonal weather patterns. Peasant farmers didn't just plant when calendars indicated, they used multiple environmental indicators to determine optimal planting times for different crops. They tested soil conditions by examining texture, moisture content, and temperature at various depths. They monitored weather patterns and adjusted planting schedules based on long-term forecasts derived from natural indicators. Spacing and placement of seeds followed principles that modern agricultural scientists have only recently begun to appreciate. Medieval farmers understood that different crops required different spacing patterns to optimize light interception, root development, and nutrient utilization. They developed specialized tools for achieving precise seed placement that maximized yields while minimizing labor requirements. The seeding tools themselves were marvels of practical engineering. Medieval seed drills, used in some regions centuries before they became common elsewhere, could plant seeds at consistent depths and spacings while covering them with appropriate amounts of soil. These devices incorporated understanding of seed physiology, soil mechanics, and precision manufacturing that required sophisticated craftsmanship and technical knowledge. Fertilizer management in medieval agriculture reveals perhaps the most impressive example of peasant technical sophistication. Contrary to assumptions about primitive farmers randomly spreading animal manure, medieval peasants practiced precise nutrient management that maintained soil fertility for centuries without external inputs. They understood that different types of manure provided different nutritional benefits for crops. Horse manure, rich in nitrogen, was used for crops requiring rapid early growth. Cow manure, with more balanced nutrient content, was applied to grain crops. Sheep manure, concentrated and slow-releasing, was reserved for long-term soil improvement projects. Pig manure was composted with other materials to create specialized fertilizer blends for specific crops and soil conditions. The composting processes they employed were sophisticated biochemical operations that controlled temperature, moisture, and oxygen levels to optimize decomposition while preserving maximum nutrients. They understood that different composting methods produced fertilizers with different characteristics and applied this knowledge to create customized soil amendments for specific purposes. But medieval peasants went far beyond animal manures in their fertilizer programs. They employed green manures, cover crops planted specifically to improve soil fertility when ploughed under. They understood which plants fixed nitrogen, which ones accumulated specific minerals, and which species provided organic matter with particular characteristics. Different green manures were selected for different soil improvement goals and integrated into complex rotation systems that maintained long-term productivity. The sophisticated understanding extends to pest management systems that combined multiple approaches in integrated programs that would impress modern organic farmers. Medieval peasants rarely relied on single pest control methods. They developed comprehensive systems that used cultural practices, biological controls, physical barriers, and targeted interventions to maintain pest populations at manageable levels. Crop rotation wasn't just about soil fertility. It was a pest management tool that disrupted the life cycles of insects, diseases, and weeds that specialized on particular crops. By rotating between different plant families with different growth patterns and harvest times, peasant farmers prevented pest populations from building up to damaging levels. Companion planting, the practice of growing certain crops together for mutual benefit, was standard practice in medieval agriculture centuries before modern scientists understood the mechanisms involved. Peasants knew that certain plant combinations repelled insects, suppressed weeds, or improved soil conditions, and they incorporated this knowledge into their cropping systems. Physical pest control methods included sophisticated trap crops, barrier systems, and habitat modifications that managed pest populations without requiring external inputs. They understood insect behavior well enough to create trapping systems that captured harmful species while preserving beneficial ones. They modified field layouts and maintained habitat areas that supported predatory insects and birds that controlled agricultural pests. The tools used for pest monitoring and control were precisely designed for specific tasks and conditions. Different types of hose were used for different weeding operations, each shaped to handle particular weed types and soil conditions efficiently. Specialized cultivators could work around growing crops without damaging them while controlling weeds and maintaining soil structure. Harvesting technology reveals another dimension of medieval agricultural sophistication that challenges assumptions about primitive farming methods. The timing of harvest operations incorporated understanding of plant physiology, weather forecasting, and post-harvest handling that optimized both quantity and quality of harvested crops. Different crops required different harvesting techniques to maximize yield and preserve quality during storage. Grain crops were harvested at specific moisture levels that balanced yield maximization with drying efficiency. Root crops were harvested under particular soil conditions that minimized damage and contamination. Leafy crops were harvested at optimal times of day to preserve nutritional content and storage quality. The tools used for harvesting were specialized instruments that had been refined through centuries of development. Different types of sickles were designed for different grain types and cutting conditions. Scythes incorporated sophisticated understanding of blade geometry, handle design, and balance that maximized cutting efficiency while minimizing operator fatigue. But the real sophistication shows in the post-harvest processing systems that converted raw agricultural products into stable, nutritious foods that could sustain communities throughout the year. These weren't simple procedures of cutting and drying. They were complex food science operations that required precise control of multiple variables to achieve desired outcomes. Grain processing involved multiple stages of cleaning, sorting, and preparation that removed contaminants while preserving nutritional quality. Different processing methods were used for different end products, each requiring specific techniques and equipment. The mills used for grinding grain incorporated precision engineering that controlled particle size distribution and prevented overheating that would damage nutritional content. Threshing operations, the process of separating grain from plant material, employed sophisticated understanding of plant structure and mechanical processes. Different threshing methods were used for different crops based on their specific characteristics. The tools and techniques were designed to maximize grain recovery while minimizing damage and contamination. Food preservation techniques went far beyond simple drying and salting to include complex fermentation processes, controlled environment storage, and sophisticated packaging methods that maintained food quality for extended periods. These systems incorporated understanding of microbiology, chemistry, and environmental control that enabled communities to maintain diverse, nutritious diets throughout seasonal cycles. The storage facilities themselves were engineered systems that controlled temperature, humidity, and air circulation to optimize preservation conditions for different food products. Underground storage areas maintained stable temperatures, Elevated granaries prevented pest access while allowing air circulation. Specialized containers provided protection while allowing monitoring of stored products. Water management systems in medieval agriculture demonstrate engineering capabilities that rival modern irrigation technology. Peasant communities developed comprehensive systems for controlling water flow, managing drainage, and optimizing moisture conditions that required sophisticated understanding of hydrology, soil science, and civil engineering. Drainage systems removed excess water from agricultural areas while preserving soil structure and preventing erosion. These weren't simple ditches dug randomly across fields. They were engineered networks that moved water efficiently while maintaining optimal soil conditions for crop production. Irrigation systems, where needed, delivered water precisely to growing crops while minimizing waste and preventing soil damage. They incorporated understanding of water pressure, flow rates, and soil infiltration that enabled efficient water use in water-limited environments. The maintenance of these complex agricultural systems required extensive technical knowledge and sophisticated problem-solving capabilities that medieval peasants developed and transmitted across generations. They created comprehensive technical traditions that preserved and improved agricultural knowledge while adapting to changing conditions and new challenges. The maintenance of these complex agricultural systems required skills that extended far beyond farming into a remarkable array of crafts, trades, and specialized knowledge that would astonish anyone who assumes medieval peasants spent their entire lives bent over in muddy fields. Step into any peasant household during the quieter winter months, and you'd discover workshops that rivaled urban craftsmen in their sophistication and output. Contrary to popular belief, medieval peasant families weren't just agricultural labourers who occasionally patched their clothes and repaired their tools. They were multi-skilled artisans who produced virtually everything they needed for daily life, while creating surplus goods for trade and sale. The economic records that survive from medieval villages reveal that most peasant households engaged in multiple craft activities that provided significant portions of their annual income. Take textile production, which formed the backbone of peasant craft economies, but involved far more complexity than most people realize. You've probably heard that medieval women simply spun wool into thread and wove it into rough cloth. The reality reveals sophisticated textile industries operating within peasant households that produced fabrics rivaling anything created in urban centres. The process began with fibre preparation that required extensive botanical knowledge and technical skill. Peasant families didn't just shear sheep and start spinning. They understood how different sheep breeds produced wool with varying characteristics. They knew which parts of the fleece provided the finest fibres and which were suitable for different end products. They employed complex washing and preparation techniques that cleaned wool while preserving its natural properties. Flax processing for linen production required even more specialized knowledge and equipment. The transformation of flax plants into fine linen thread involved multiple stages of retting, breaking, scutching, and heckling that required precise timing and technique. Each stage used specialized tools that had been refined over generations of development. The final products could range from coarse work fabrics to fine textiles suitable for the wealthy urban markets. The spinning technologies employed in peasant households would surprise modern textile enthusiasts. Medieval spinning wheels weren't crude devices that barely functioned. They were precision instruments that allowed skilled operators to produce thread with consistent thickness, strength, and texture. Different wheel designs were optimized for different fiber types and thread specifications. But the real sophistication shows in the dyeing processes that peasant communities employed to create textiles in virtually every color imaginable. Contrary to assumptions about drab, undyed peasant clothing, medieval rural communities had access to extensive color palettes created through sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry, mineral processing, and dye application techniques. Peasant dyers knew dozens of plants that yielded different colors under different processing conditions. They understood how mordants, chemical substances that fixed dyes to fibers, affected both color intensity and permanence. They developed complex dyeing sequences that created colors not achievable through single-stage processes. The knowledge extended to regional specialties that created valuable trade products. Certain villages became renowned for particular colors or dyeing techniques that commanded premium prices in distant markets. These weren't accidental discoveries. They represented generations of experimentation, refinement, and knowledge accumulation that elevated peasant communities to positions of technological leadership. Weaving operations in peasant households produced textiles that challenged urban production in both quality and innovation. Medieval looms weren't simple devices for creating basic cloth. They were sophisticated machines capable of producing complex patterns, varying textures, and specialized fabrics for specific purposes. Different loom designs were employed for different products. Simple tabletop looms created narrow bands and straps. Large floor looms produced wide fabrics suitable for clothing and household textiles. Specialized looms created technical textiles like ropes, sails, and heavy-duty work fabrics that required specific construction techniques. The patterns and designs woven into peasant textiles reveal artistic sensibilities and cultural sophistication that contradict stereotypes about rural ignorance and cultural poverty. Archaeological textile fragments show complex geometric patterns, narrative scenes, and decorative elements that demonstrate high levels of artistic skill and cultural knowledge. But textile production was just one aspect of the diverse craft activities that filled peasant workshops. Woodworking represented another major craft tradition that produced everything from simple household items to complex machinery and architectural components. Medieval peasant woodworkers weren't just whittling sticks with crude knives. They employed sophisticated understanding of wood properties, joinery techniques, and tool technologies that enabled them to create furniture, machinery, and construction materials that lasted for centuries. Different wood species were selected for specific applications based on their mechanical properties, resistance to decay, and workability characteristics. Oak was prized for structural applications requiring strength and durability. Pine and other softwoods were used for applications where workability was more important than strength. Specialized woods like yew were reserved for applications requiring specific performance characteristics. The tools employed in peasant woodworking workshops included precision instruments that enabled complex operations, hand planes that could create smooth surfaces and precise dimensions, chisels designed for specific cutting operations, specialized boring tools for creating holes with exact diameters and alignments. These weren't mass-produced implements. They were often custom-made by the craftsmen who used them, reflecting deep understanding of tool design and manufacturing. Joinery techniques employed in peasant woodworking would impress modern furniture makers. Complex joints that created strong, durable connections without relying on metal fasteners or adhesives. mortise and tenon joints that could withstand enormous loads while allowing for wood movement, dovetail joints that created beautiful functional connections for boxes and drawers. The furniture and household items produced in peasant workshops demonstrate both functional excellence and aesthetic sophistication. Archaeological examples show chairs, tables, chests, and other items with elegant proportions, decorative details, and construction quality that rival contemporary urban production. But woodworking extended far beyond household items into complex machinery and construction projects that required advanced engineering knowledge. Peasant communities built and maintained mills, bridges, and other infrastructure projects that incorporated sophisticated understanding of structural mechanics, hydraulics, and construction techniques. Mill construction, in particular, required integration of multiple technical specialties. The wooden machinery that converted water power into rotational motion for grinding grain involved precision gear cutting, bearing design, and power transmission that required extensive mechanical knowledge. The millstones themselves required specialized knowledge of stone selection, surface preparation, and maintenance procedures. Metalworking represented another crucial craft tradition within peasant communities that went far beyond basic blacksmithing into sophisticated metallurgy and precision manufacturing. Medieval peasant smiths weren't just heating iron and hammering it into crude shapes. They employed advanced understanding of metallurgy, heat treatment, and manufacturing processes that produced tools, weapons, and machinery comparable to the finest urban production. The forge operations in peasant workshops incorporated precise temperature control, atmosphere management, and timing that optimized metal properties for specific applications. Different heating and cooling cycles produced materials with different characteristics. Controlled atmospheres prevented oxidation and contamination that would compromise performance. Tool manufacturing required particular sophistication because peasant communities depended on their implements for survival and productivity. Agricultural tools needed to maintain sharp edges while resisting wear and breakage. Woodworking tools required precision geometry and consistent performance. Household implements needed durability combined with ease of maintenance and repair. The heat treatment processes employed by peasant smiths would satisfy modern metallurgical standards. They understood how different cooling rates affected steel properties. They employed various quenching media to achieve specific hardness and toughness combinations. They used tempering procedures that balanced hardness with resistance to brittle failure. But metalworking also extended into decorative applications that reveal artistic capabilities and cultural sophistication. Archaeological examples of peasant-produced metalwork include items with complex decorative patterns, sophisticated surface treatments, and elegant functional designs that demonstrate high levels of skill and aesthetic sensibility. Pottery production within peasant communities created not just basic storage containers, but sophisticated ceramic products that served multiple functions while demonstrating considerable technical and artistic skill. Medieval peasant potters weren't just shaping clay into crude vessels. They employed advanced understanding of clay preparation, forming techniques and firing processes that produced ceramics comparable to urban production. The clay preparation processes incorporated knowledge of different clay types and their properties. Peasant potters knew how to blend different clays to achieve specific working characteristics and final properties. They understood how various additives affected clay behavior during forming and firing. Forming techniques went beyond simple wheel throwing to include complex construction methods for large vessels, specialized shapes, and decorative elements. Hand-building techniques created vessels that couldn't be produced on wheels. Complex assemblies combined multiple components into functional systems. Firing operations required sophisticated understanding of kiln design, temperature control, and atmosphere management. Different firing techniques produced ceramics with different properties and appearances. Glazing processes created surfaces that were both functional and decorative. The range of ceramic products produced in peasant workshops included storage containers, cooking vessels, serving pieces, and specialized items for particular applications. Archaeological examples show items with elegant forms, sophisticated decorative treatments, and technical features that demonstrate advanced ceramic knowledge. Food processing represented another area where peasant communities demonstrated remarkable technical sophistication that extended far beyond basic cooking into complex preservation, fermentation, and preparation techniques that maximize nutrition while creating diverse, flavorful products. Bread production involved understanding of grain selection, flour processing, dough preparation, and baking techniques that produced consistent, nutritious results. Different bread types required different ingredients and procedures. Peasant bakers understood how various factors affected bread quality and adjusted their techniques accordingly. But bread was just one product of grain processing operations that included multiple techniques for creating different food products from the same raw materials. Porridges, gruels, and other grain-based foods required specific preparation methods. Fermented grain products involved understanding of microbiology and fermentation control. Brewing operations within peasant households produced not just basic ale, but diverse alcoholic beverages with different characteristics and applications. Medieval peasant brewers understood how different ingredients, processing methods, and fermentation conditions affected final products. They produced seasonal variations, medicinal preparations, and specialty products for different occasions and purposes. Dairy processing created diverse products that provided nutrition, preserved milk production, and generated trade goods. Peasant communities produced various cheeses, fermented dairy products, and preserved items that extended the utility of milk production while creating valuable commodities. Meat processing and preservation involved sophisticated understanding of anatomy, biochemistry, and preservation techniques that converted animal products into diverse foods with extended storage life. Different preservation methods produce products with different characteristics and applications. The preservation techniques employed by peasant communities incorporated understanding of multiple preservation mechanisms. Salt curing, smoking, fermentation, and controlled drying each provided different advantages and required different procedures. Complex preservation programs combined multiple techniques to optimize results. But food processing also extended into medicinal preparations that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of plant chemistry, extraction techniques, and therapeutic applications. Peasant communities produced herbal medicines, tinctures, and other preparations that provided health care for both humans and animals. The knowledge systems that supported these diverse craft activities represented some of the most sophisticated technical traditions in medieval Europe. Peasant communities maintained comprehensive bodies of practical knowledge that were transmitted across generations through apprenticeship systems, informal education, and community knowledge sharing. These technical traditions incorporated not just procedural knowledge about how to perform specific tasks, but understanding of underlying principles that enabled innovation and adaptation to changing circumstances. Peasant craftsmen understood why particular techniques worked and could modify their approaches to handle new situations or requirements. The innovation within peasant craft traditions created continuous improvement in techniques, tools, and products. Successful innovations spread rapidly through community networks and trade relationships. Regional specializations developed as particular communities became renowned for specific products or techniques. The economic impact of these diverse craft activities transformed peasant communities from subsistence agricultural settlements into complex economies that participated actively in regional and international trade networks. The surplus production from peasant workshops provided significant income that supported improved living standards and community development. The economic impact of these diverse craft activities transformed peasant communities from subsistence agricultural settlements into complex economies that participated actively in regional and international trade networks. But as we step back from our detailed exploration of medieval peasant life, what emerges is something far more profound than just economic sophistication or technical innovation. What we've discovered together tonight is that the medieval peasants who formed the backbone of European society for nearly 1,000 years were nothing like the ignorant, brutish caricatures that populate our popular imagination. These were communities of remarkable ingenuity, social sophistication, and cultural richness that created some of the most sustainable and resilient societies in human history. The seasonal mastery we witnessed, where every aspect of community life synchronized with natural rhythms, while maximizing efficiency and minimizing waste, represents a level of ecological integration that modern societies are still struggling to achieve. These weren't people fighting against nature or barely surviving its challenges. They were communities that had learnt to work with natural systems so effectively that they maintained prosperity for centuries without depleting the resources that sustained them. The social networks we explored reveal something equally remarkable about human organization and cooperation. Medieval peasant communities created support systems that ensured virtually no one faced hardship alone, while maintaining individual initiative and community prosperity. They balanced individual needs with collective welfare through organic systems of mutual obligation and reciprocal assistance that operated without bureaucracy or external enforcement. Perhaps most striking is how these communities managed to maintain such sophisticated technical knowledge across generations without formal educational institutions or written technical manuals. The apprenticeship systems, knowledge-sharing networks, and informal education processes that preserved and transmitted complex craft traditions, agricultural techniques, and social practices represent some of the most effective knowledge management systems ever developed. But there's something deeper here that speaks to fundamental questions about human potential and social organization. These peasant communities achieved their remarkable sophistication not despite their lack of formal education, centralized authority, or advanced technology, but because they developed alternative approaches that were often more effective than top-down systems. The democratic governance structures that emerged in peasant villages, where ordinary people debated complex issues and made collective decisions about resource management and community policies, challenge assumptions about political sophistication and civic capability. These weren't educated elites trained in political theory. They were working people who developed practical democratic processes through experience and necessity. The technical innovations we examined reveal something equally important about human creativity and problem-solving capability. Medieval peasants didn't have access to scientific laboratories, engineering schools, or research institutions, but they developed sophisticated understanding of metallurgy, mechanics, chemistry, and biology through careful observation, systematic experimentation, and collaborative knowledge building that produced results comparable to formal scientific methods. Their approach to risk management and community resilience offers lessons that remain relevant today. Instead of relying on external institutions or centralized systems for security, peasant communities created distributed networks of mutual support that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances while maintaining stability across generations. The environmental sustainability we observed throughout peasant agricultural and craft systems resulted not from primitive simplicity, but from sophisticated understanding of natural processes and long-term thinking that prioritized system health over short-term extraction. They created circular economies where waste from one process became input for another, where biological systems were enhanced rather than replaced, and where human activities supported rather than undermined ecological health. But perhaps what's most remarkable is how these communities maintained cultural richness, artistic expression, and intellectual life while dealing with the practical challenges of survival and prosperity. The textiles, crafts, music, and storytelling traditions that flourished in peasant communities weren't afterthoughts or luxuries. They were integral parts of community life that provided meaning, beauty, and cultural continuity alongside material prosperity. This challenges our modern tendency to assume that cultural sophistication requires leisure, education, and economic surplus that comes at the expense of practical work. Medieval peasants integrated artistic expression and cultural development into their daily productive activities in ways that enriched both their material and spiritual lives. The gender roles we observed, while different from modern arrangements, reveal more complexity and female agency than popular stereotypes suggest. Women in peasant communities wielded significant economic power, made crucial decisions about household and community affairs, and contributed specialized knowledge and skills that were essential for community survival and prosperity. The marriage and family systems, rather than being oppressive arrangements that stifled individual choice, appear to have created stable foundations for both personal fulfillment and community welfare. The balance between individual desires and collective needs, the integration of romantic affection with practical compatibility, and the support systems that helped couples navigate life's challenges offer insights into relationship structures that modern societies might learn from. But underlying all these specific discoveries is a broader revelation about human capability and social potential. What medieval peasant communities achieved suggests that ordinary people, when they have genuine control over their lives and environments, can create remarkably sophisticated and successful societies. They didn't need external experts to tell them how to manage their resources, organize their communities, or solve their problems. They developed their own expertise through experience, collaboration, and systematic knowledge building. They created their own institutions through organic processes that reflected their values and circumstances rather than imposed systems that might not fit their needs. This doesn't mean we should romanticize medieval peasant life or ignore its genuine hardships and limitations. Life expectancy was shorter, medical care was limited, and individual choices were constrained by community needs and social circumstances. But it does suggest that we might have something to learn from their approaches to community organisation, environmental management, and knowledge development. In our modern world, where many people feel disconnected from both nature and community, where technical knowledge is increasingly concentrated among specialists, and where economic systems often prioritise short-term profits over long-term sustainability, medieval peasant communities offer examples of alternative approaches that achieved remarkable results. Their success at creating prosperous, sustainable, and culturally rich communities suggests that human societies have more potential for self-organisation and adaptation than we often assume. It challenges narratives of inevitable progress that dismiss earlier periods as primitive or irrelevant to contemporary challenges. The resourcefulness, cooperation, and innovation we observed in medieval peasant life remind us that human creativity and problem-solving capability aren't dependent on formal institutions or advanced technology. People working together with shared goals and mutual support can achieve remarkable things with whatever resources are available to them. Perhaps most importantly, medieval peasant communities demonstrate that sustainable prosperity, social cohesion, and cultural richness are compatible goals rather than competing priorities. They created societies that supported both individual fulfillment and collective welfare, that balanced human needs with environmental health, and that maintained stability while adapting to changing circumstances. As we face contemporary challenges around climate change, social inequality, and community resilience, the example of medieval peasant communities suggests that solutions might come not from top-down technical fixes or centralized planning, but from grassroots innovation, community cooperation, and organic development of systems that reflect local needs and circumstances. Their story reminds us that every period of history contains wisdom and insight that transcends its specific time and place. By understanding how people in different circumstances created successful communities, we expand our sense of what's possible and enrich our toolkit for addressing contemporary challenges. But perhaps the most profound lesson from our exploration tonight is simply recognition of the fundamental dignity, intelligence, and creativity of ordinary people throughout history. Medieval peasants weren't primitive ancestors struggling toward modern enlightenment. They were fully human communities that created remarkable societies suited to their circumstances and values. Their achievements remind us that innovation, sophistication, and cultural richness aren't the exclusive domains of elites or modern societies. They emerge wherever people have the freedom and support to develop their capabilities and work together towards shared goals. As we return to our contemporary world, we carry with us new appreciation for the complexity and richness of human experience across different times and places. The medieval peasants who seemed so distant and different at the beginning of our journey now reveal themselves as fellow humans whose struggles, achievements, and wisdom speak directly to our own experiences and aspirations. Their legacy lives on not just in the agricultural techniques, craft traditions, and social innovations they developed, but in the reminder that human communities have remarkable potential for creating prosperity, sustainability, and meaning when they're organized around cooperation, wisdom, and care for both people and place. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this exploration, we have many more fascinating topics waiting for you. Check out our other videos. Whether you're here to learn, to relax, or both, we're grateful you spent this time with us. Rest well, and we'll see you in the next one.